3. Betty. I'm holding two photos of Betty, one in each hand. One is of Betty and Clarence on the day they got married, and the other photo was of her and one of my siblings taken in 2015. There's a great deal I wish to share about Betty and our relationship. However, once again, it will need to come in stages. Facing her and the demons she left for me to fight has been a monumental task. Writing about her for the first time ever is certainly going to be a challenge. If some famous author was percolating up a character in the creative brain as a conniving, cruel stepmother for a novel, I'm sure they would not hesitate to model it after Betty. The material gathered on her alone would make any novel compelling. The trouble is, this novel is not a fantasy novel, it's a real life, and I'm the one who lived it. I'm uncertain, even worried and concerned on how much to share and still portray Betty as a mother who did, in her way, love me. Unfortunately, Betty was extremely complex and had caused me a great deal of pain, trauma, suffering, and grief. Her character held many shadows that were complex, confusing, layered, and well disguised. Unlike Clarence, whose character is easier to discover, easier to warm to as a child, easier to find the words and feelings for, I struggle with explaining Betty and the relationship with her. I desperately wanted to love her and have the mother and daughter relationship that we all crave. In my early years, I certainly did love her, and I thought she loved me. In reality, I realized I was always scared of her, even as a small child. Of course, she was the authority in our home, and back in my day, children were expected to be seen and not heard. In my first chapter, I've already disclosed that I believe that my older brother Andrew was used as a scapegoat for things done to me. Though I do not have conclusive evidence that it was Betty that harmed me that day, I'm sure that after you finish hearing my story, you will also come to the conclusion that Betty's original version of the events told to me years ago will leave you with the same doubts that I was left in. I think you can all conclude that a 3-year-old child could not have done what she said he'd done to me. It leaves you wondering, what else did she do? When I stare at the wedding photo of my adopted mother, I see a beautiful young woman, filled with hope in the world and in her future. I see her face as a young woman filled with happiness. In contrast, I look at the other photo taken of her in 2015, and I see the complete opposite. Her once shiny black hair, now grey, her eyes lifeless. They don't even look into the camera lens, but down, as if she deliberately wants you to see that she is unhappy, as if she is not wanting to be where she is, or to be with the person she is with, who happens to be one of my adopted siblings. More so, she exhibits a vacant look, as if no one is at home, a distant, cold stare, as if looking into a void, as if her soul has already left her body. Her skin is strewn with wrinkles, deep lines cover her face and arms, her features now exposing the tale of a hard and difficult existence that has not only hardened her face, but hardened her heart. I once again look back at the wedding photos, but this time I really look into her face. I draw in a deep breath and I exhale. I'm taken aback by the stark comparisons of the two images in front of me. I see her face unmarked from aging lines, her black hair elegantly styled, the most pleasant smile emanating from her features. Her beautiful lace wedding dress sweetly fitted and gathered around her feet in a perfect circle as she stands proudly beside her new husband, Clarence. As I stare at these two photos so different from the other, I begin to wonder, when did she resign herself to a life of misery? When did she choose not to allow happiness in? What caused her to do so? Was it one thing or many? When did life become such a disappointment to her? Did someone take something from her that she could never reconcile or recover from? Did her marriage and wedding day seem to promise so much joy and hope, only to be dashed against one rock of disappointment and heartache after another? When did my adopted mother decide that she could not steer her own happiness, but rather choose to wallow in her own misery? Was there no escape for her, no choices to decide to change her course? My adopted mother was 27 years old when I was adopted, and truth be told, I don't think I ever remember seeing her looking young. Her wedding photo, taken 7 years before I was born, is the only evidence that she was once a young, vibrant and lovely woman. I don't know much of her life as a child. She never really spoke about it. Perhaps that is my first clue about the beginning of her pain. Perhaps there are secrets there that she never felt safe to share or to seek help for. The only stories I have of her childhood mostly come from others. The stories, or should I say slight insights, given me of the briefest images of her life never answered any questions for me. Her father died long before I was born. Apparently her mother lived with Clarence and her for a short time. I did not know when she moved in or when she died or how much involvement she had in my life. Grandmother, to whom I have no recollection of at all, apparently loved me enough to will me her duchess, bed and wardrobe before she passed away. It was a beautiful pink and white pattern, and I adored it. There were no photos of any of my grandparents or aunts or uncles ever displayed in our home. Not ever, not one. Other than 2 black and white framed photos, one of Betty and Clarence on their wedding day, and the other one of her sister's wedding photo, where Betty was a bridesmaid. No other photos of any other family existed in our home. I only found a photo of Betty's parents after she died. It was the first time that I'd ever laid eyes on them. I'm not sure how many siblings Betty had. I only met 2 of her sisters. Both of them I liked. One of them, Patty, had 1 child and lost her husband early in the relationship and never remarried. Olive had about 6 children and was happily married. I did not see them much at all, but when I did, I enjoyed their visits, especially Olive. She was always happy and outgoing, which was in great contrast to Betty. Betty did state once that she had a brother who died young and a sister that died of breast cancer. Betty never talked about her parents or siblings. All I know is she grew up in Brisbane, Australia. I do not know how she met Clarence or if she even worked. In my heart, I always yearned to know the true her, the one before the pain. I wanted and begged her to get help, but she refused. Others who I reached out to ignored my pleas or refuted that there was ever a problem. By the time I had the ability to force Betty's hand to get help, unwillingly by her, and a court order, it was far too late. Betty continued to lie and manipulate others right up until the end to get her own way. Help failed us, and it failed her as well. In 2016, Marla rang me and begged me to visit Betty. I'd had about 8 years away from her with no contact at all. But Marla saw her regularly and became deeply concerned at the state of Betty's home and the state of Betty. On top of her concerns was that Betty had a gun. Marla had told me she had visited and had an argument, and it had ensued in some very harsh words coming from Betty. It was common for them to have verbal lashes, but this time Betty threatened to shoot Marla if she did not leave the house. Marla stood in the lounge room frozen in fear and disbelief and half expected Betty to show up with a gun. She could hear Betty rummaging around in her room. Marla left the house uncertain and worried and contacted me immediately. I was reluctant to go. I was living a life without Betty in it, and I was all the better for it. However, I knew Marla kept in close contact with Betty, and I knew full well of how destructive that contact was. In fact, I would hear about their fights and how terrible Marla was still being treated. The relationship with Marla and Betty was pretty dysfunctional, but Marla refused to let go. Betty was a mother and a grandmother to her children. To Marla, that was the end of the subject. I went to see Betty for Marla's sake. I wasn't convinced Betty had a gun due to all of our Australian laws around gun ownership. I knew that should have been impossible for her to have a license for one. I never saw Clarence ever have one. I never knew Betty to want one and never saw her ever use one. So I thought it highly unlikely. I just thought it was one of Betty's usual aggressive displays and lying to upset Marla. When I arrived at her property with Marla, I had to jump the fence due to the gate being locked. With trepidation, I knocked on the door. Marla chose to stay a fair way back and out of view. I had no idea what to expect, as a lot had come and gone between Betty and I, and with a lot of distance between us these past 8 years. As much as I did not wish to have any contact with her on this day in 2016, my heart would not allow me to walk away. Despite what I endured with Betty, I considered that things must be terribly bad for Marla to beg me to do something. I deeply considered that Betty had been my mother. She had nursed me in times of sickness and had done things for me I truly appreciated. Of course, my mind and conscience was in a battle. I seriously did not want to get involved, and as she was now threatening to kill her own children, this was a whole new level of concern for me. If her threats were real, it may be time to call the police. I also knew that the minute that the door opened, I would battle every hurt she ever poured out on me, and I wondered how I would cope. A part of me did hope that she would be glad for their help, maybe even slightly pleased to see me. But I had to be realistic, and I had to brace myself. I knew I was walking into a dark den of unknowns. Would I find her still abusive, judgmental, and condemning towards me? Or was she just angry at Marla? Would I find a woman changed, regretful and sorry, wanting to mend the bridges of the past? Who and what would I find standing on the other side of the door? And I damn well hoped her gun threat was a bluff. I walked up to the door, took a deep breath, braced myself and knocked. And for a while, there's nothing. So I knock again, and I wait. Betty opens the door, and it takes all my effort not to look shocked. I watch her look me up and down like I'm some unwanted stray cat at her door as she proceeds to not know me, her eyes cold and burning right through me. I stare up at her, immediately taken aback and regret my choice to knock on her door. I was used to seeing her unkempt, skinny and older looking, but not this. She stands in the doorway slightly hunched over, wearing baggy, mismatched old clothing. Her skin colour was terribly deathly grey, her frame extremely fragile and thin, her eyes sad but cold. She was so unkempt, she'd not even bothered to trim off the large grey hairs in her chin that danced around when she spoke, and it was hard to avert my eyes from them. As she stood square in the doorway, ensuring that I made no attempt to enter, I caught a smell coming from the inside of the home. But I wasn't sure. Was it from her, I thought, or both? "Who are you?" she croaks. I'm taken aback. I hesitate, not sure what to say. Is she playing a game? I respond by saying, "You know who I am, Betty." I don't call her Mum. I haven't referred to her in that way for many years. Her reply is to deny knowing me and tells me to go away. Each time I respond the same, "You know who I am, Betty." For some reason, I do not state my name. I figure by doing so is playing right into her game, and I'm not playing. So I just say it again when she asks, "Who are you?" For a brief moment, I almost believe her, thinking that perhaps her mind has really gone and she doesn't know who I am. But I also know her too well, and I decide to stand firm. I figure she is trying to hurt me by pretending to know me. I don't bite. I don't take the bait. I just stood there looking back at her, not moving, not leaving, but not turning away either, and defiantly not offering my name. I tell her Marla is concerned about her and wanted me to check up on her. She glares back at me and tells me to get off her property yet again. I pause and consider what I should do. She stands there silent, just glaring at me. I figure if she won't engage, then there is nothing more I can do. So I begin to step away. Then suddenly she asks me to wait, and I stop and I turn around. I watch her reach behind her, and then she turns to hand me a photo. As she does, she says, "Give this to your sister." Well, of course she knows who I am. Her words now prove it. It was a game. I feel a little victorious and count round one for Kerry. I take the photo. I do not see the significance in it. It's a random photo of Marla and her kids. I'm pretty sure Betty is wanting to send Marla a message by it. That's the thing. You never know what game Betty is playing or why. Sometimes you don't even know you're in a game until it's too late. She lingers for a moment as I look at the photo and look back at her face scowling cold. She's waiting for a reaction. I don't react or ask any questions. I'm deeply saddened to find her this way, not only unchanged and seemingly even more bitter and angry, but now denying she even knows who I am. So basically, 8 years away created no remorse at all. 8 years with no contact with me or her grandchildren and great-grandkids, nothing. Not a letter or a phone call to any of us, and none to her. How and why this came about will be revealed in my story, and I think the question will be not why did we stop contact, but why did we not stop contact sooner? Though I didn't show it, I felt incredibly uncomfortable. I was fighting being a kid again. I know full well what can happen when you are in her presence, and how hard it is to stay within your adult self. It's a battle so deep, and it takes a monumental task to stay present and not fall prey to her ability to make you feel small. Betty was very artful in knowing just how to bring you down with just one look, let alone when she actually opens her mouth. I did my best, hoping and praying that years separated from her and a bunch of counselling would stand the test, that I would not break and I would not revert back to a fearful child. I would hold strong and face her and keep myself intact. For a brief moment, I thought she might continue talking, allow Marla to enter or something, but next thing I see her turning away and shutting the door right in my face. Marla was out of sight but close by. She heard it all. She was visibly upset, desperately wanting Betty to get help, but most of all wanting Betty back in her life. I know how she felt. I'd been there before. The guilt eats at you and you blame yourself for any discord or conflict created in the relationship. You agonize over the barriers and distancing that Betty exhibits towards you. And God forbid, when she shuts you out completely for hours, days, weeks, or months, it would really mess you up. As adopted kids, this type of behavior would cause our stomachs to churn until you almost threw up. For me, I was not fazed by being locked out or a door shut in my face. By now, I actually welcomed it. But it had taken a lot of hard work to get to this point, where I know walking away is far better than staying. It's healthier. It took a lot of counselling and facing some terrible demons to extract myself from Betty's control over me. I was stronger now, and this face-off was certainly going to expose whether all my hard work and absence had paid off or not. Marla had not walked down this road, even though I tried to encourage her to do it. She refused to walk away and put a stop to the destructive influence called mother. I sympathised with Marla. I knew how she was feeling, and I was not going to leave her cope with Betty alone, especially knowing how bad things had become. If anything good came of it, hopefully it was from Marla to set herself free from the hold that Betty had on her. We went back to Marla's place. I decided to stay with her for the night, just to ensure she did not do anything silly by going back to Betty's house alone. After a discussion on what to do, we decided to ring a helpline, who suggested calling an ambulance service to do a medical check on her. This, we hoped, would result in Betty being taken to the hospital and getting her the appropriate help she needed. I could go back to my life and extract myself of any more involvement, but alas, it did not work out that way at all. Unfortunately, whoever the ambulance officers were, the ones that were sent, even those stating that they didn't do a check on Betty, said there was nothing they could do. Although she looked unwell, her vitals were fine. They couldn't do any more as Betty had refused to go with them, and they couldn't force her to get in the ambulance without her approval or a court order. This resulted in another conversation with my sister, who was incredulous about the situation. Both of us knew something was seriously going on for Betty. Marla begged me to do something more. So the next day we went to the local courthouse together to apply for a mental health assessment order. If we were able to prove that she was at risk, perhaps suicidal, the court would order a medical examination to determine if she was at risk and what interventions might be needed. The clerk told us about if our concerns met the criteria for the court to intervene, they would arrange for an ambulance to pick her up, take her to the nearest hospital for an assessment. Betty would not be able to refuse. She would be forced to go. This was my epiphany moment, my Waterloo event, where I had to face my past to try and help Betty, and in doing so, help my sister too. As much as Marla wanted Betty to get help, she flatly refused to fill out the forms herself, however, insisting that I fill them out and sign them instead. Basically, I had to state why I thought Betty was at risk, based on her current state and past behaviours. It was not hard to recall a few good examples of what I'd lived through, of behaviours that warranted intervention but never received. This was the first time in my life, this was not the first time in my life that I ever made some sort of legal statement about Betty, but that's for another time. A part of me felt angry about having to do it and having to recount some of the terrible things I went through with her and witnessed that no one ever helped me with. I was now 54 years old and was still asking for help, and that was the bit that I was upset about the most. I stood there at the counter of the courthouse, managing to pull myself together and support my sister, while recalling some of the most awful moments of my childhood with Betty, in an attempt to actually help Betty. In doing so, I knew that she was going to be incredibly angry with me about it. I knew that I would be the target of her wrath, regardless of my good intentions for doing so. My sister Marla was definitely not wanting to put any evidence in writing on the document or sign a name to it. She wasn't silly. She knew what would happen to those who dared to override Mother. She had plenty to say verbally, but refused to write it down, using the excuse that I had better handwriting than her. I knew why she wasn't keen to write anything, because that meant the most powerful action of all would come to those who rise up against Mother, the most powerful word created by adoption, and an action Betty used well: rejection. I had walked the road of rejection many times before. I knew the drill. It no longer held any power over me. I thankfully couldn't care less about being rejected by Betty. I disconnected from that emotional blackmail a long time ago. I filled out the forms and headed home and waited to hear from the hospital. Betty was picked up by the ambulance about a week later. Yes, it took nearly 7 days for them to act. She was taken to a local hospital unwillingly. When I showed up to the hospital and asked at the desk where she was, the receptionist told me to just go on through. I told them it was not wise for me to do that I needed to speak to a social worker first. I explained that Betty was here due to a court order, and she definitely was not going to be happy to see me at all. Within minutes, I was met by the nicest social worker who allowed me to share the details of why I needed to brief them on my relationship with Betty, or should I say, my non-relationship with her. I needed them to understand some of the history and the potential for an explosion to occur once Betty saw me. I was told not to tell Betty that I was responsible for placing the court order on her. I didn't like the idea, but the whole hospital staff thought it best. The social worker guided me to a bed in the emergency ward, but stayed out of sight. I could hear Betty talking nicely to a nurse behind the curtain. However, the moment I appeared in her line of sight, her eyes shut up, she glares at me and raises her voice. She launches into a tirade of abuse, blaming me for her current circumstances of being taken and held against her will. "You did this to me, Kerry, didn't you?" she repeats over and over, then pauses momentarily for me to respond. Funny, her memory of who I am just suddenly came back. She called me by my name, Kerry. Of course, I denied it, as I was asked to. She attacked me even more, calling me a liar. She would not let it drop and kept repeating her accusations, even though I tried to change the subject. Finally, I said, "Let's play hypothetical, Betty." To my surprise, she agrees. "Hypothetically," I began, "if I did do it, if I did organise to have you admitted against your will, to have you medically looked at and to get help, what would you say?" As quick as a whip, her head tilted back and she rolls her eyes around and stared straight up at me. And an old familiar dialogue that I'd heard over and over in my life came spewing out of her mouth. "I'd wipe you," she said. lifted her shoulders and arms as if physically tossing me out. I would tell you to get out and don't come back, and you're not my daughter. That's what I'd say to you, she shouts. The look on her face was so smug, so forthright and adamant as she glares at me, trying to penetrate my soul, searching into me to see if she'd hit the mark and caused me pain. Within an instant, I flashed back at her. Well, I didn't do it then, did I? Shrugging my shoulders and smiling back at her like a Cheshire cat. My response caught me off guard. I was calm and composed, and even a little bit cocky. Her threats of rejection did not hurt me. It bounced right off me like rain on an umbrella. It hit and just fell to the ground. I was still dry and unaffected, and I'm counting round 2 to Kerry. I could tell she was shocked, but something else happened. It was like she looked at me in a whole new way. I'm sure she wanted to call me the B word. I could see it brewing behind her eyes and pursed lips. I waited for a moment. I'm sure it was coming, but it doesn't. Then another shift happens. She softens, lowering her voice, almost crying. Now she's trying to reel me in. Now it's a sympathy dance. She cries for Clarence. Says she misses him and wants to be with him. She is worried about her cat and admits that things have been a bit tough of late. However, I don't budge. In my mind, my wall is still up. I've seen her do this before many, many times. When force and threats don't work, the poor me card is played, and she plays it very well. She's had lots and lots of practice. I see it for what it is, but I decide to soften my tone. I tell her that perhaps it's for the best that she's in hospital, and to let the staff check her out. I tell her she does not look well at all, and that we are worried about her, and that maybe her stay will be short and she can go home sooner than she thinks. For the life of me, she agrees. I cannot believe my ears. She capitulates to my reasoning, but I catch myself. Come on, Kerry. You know she's a master at manipulation. She might be saying yes with her lips, but her conniving dark inner self is surely working on a plan. Don't be taken in. Against all known realities of Betty, I hope and pray for the best. I hope she takes advantage of the help offered. By the look of her, she wasn't going to last much longer. Clearly she'd stopped eating and totally stopped caring about herself at all. I don't stay for long, just long enough to get her cooperation. I know that things can change in a dime with her, and I figure it's best to leave while I have it in a place of compliance. Eventually I get the keys to her house to feed the cat, because one minute she loves the neighbour and trusts her, and the next thing she doesn't. So I say goodbye to her and turn to talk quietly with the hospital staff. I ask for a mask, because my sister has warned me that the house smelt terrible when she was in it last. This is something new to me. Growing up, we might have been poor, but the house was always clean and tidy. Even though we worked in the charcoal pits and our clothes were covered in charcoal grime, they were always washed, cleaned, and ironed. Betty always had a clean home for us to live in. She may have had bouts of being a bit dishevelled and not taking great care of herself, but everything else was taken care of well. It was not abnormal for Betty to not bathe or shower for a couple of days, but she never stank. I always wondered if she suffered from some sort of manic or depressive disorder due to her stark changes in her behaviours and lack of self-care. I was hoping that this hospital visit might help shed some light on all of it. However, I was not impressed when I found out that when she first came to the hospital, she was taken straight to the mental health facility, who after 15 minutes discharged her over to the emergency ward. I couldn't believe my ears. I'd assumed that mental health was coming to see her and hold her for assessments, but no, they'd already seen her and then sent her over to the emergency department. I was shattered to hear this. It defeated one of the purposes of the intervention. However, the nurses in the emergency ward reassured me that Betty was not going home, and plans were underway to hold her longer and get some assessments done. They had heard our conversation and Betty's behaviour, and was just as surprised as I was to find out that mental health team had not done their job properly. With Betty's keys to her home in my hand, a mask from the hospital and some peppermint essential oil I always carried with me, I headed off to her home. It was now dark outside. I'd been there for quite some time. I was tired and emotional. Thankfully at the time I had a friend with me, a fellow adoptee, who knew some of my story, had witnessed the interaction at the hospital. I was ever so grateful to have her with me. She understood all too well the battles adoptees endured. Her support was so crucial in this difficult and confronting moment. Now we're headed into Betty's home, one I'd never been in before, and I wondered what I'd find. On the drive over, I had so much of my life with Betty flashing in my head, so much my childhood had been triggered in my visit with her. There were a lot of memories playing around in my mind. As a child, Betty was never outgoing. She preferred to stay home a lot. She didn't seem to have any friends at all. She never had any hobbies outside the home, never played sport or a musical instrument, and I never heard her sing. Later in life, she volunteered for an animal shelter, and I know she loved to play bingo and enjoyed a shandy. Of course, she liked to fish every now and then, but most of all, she loved to hunt for oysters and would often do it for hours on end, hunting for them and eating them. Sorry to anyone that actually likes them, but I think they're gross. They look gross to even look at, let alone eat them. As a young child, I would often hear the neighbours talking to her over the fence, but she'd hang back, trying not to get too friendly. They'd invite her over, and in most cases she would decline. I do not ever remember any neighbours being in a home in Inala ever. What I do remember most of all is that socialising that did occur was when Clarence was around. He was the one that seemed to encourage our time with neighbours or extended family. I can never remember a birthday party as a child. I cannot say they did not happen. I just do not remember any of them. I'm also extremely vague at any Christmas celebrations in our home as well. I don't remember any until I was married. Once again, I'm not saying they did not happen. I just do not remember any Christmas celebrations at home as a child or in my teens. I do remember attending Christmas celebrations with my father and his work colleagues and families outside the home. I remember because he always ran the event, played Santa for the kids. In the afternoons when most of the people went home, I would get up and sing in front of everyone. Betty would only permit me to attend 2 birthday parties of her friends from school. I do not remember going to anyone else's place, but anyone coming to my place to celebrate my birthday. There were no play dates as a small child. No child slept over, and I never slept over anyone else's place either. If I did, I have no memory of them ever occurring at all. I remember a lady that did try to befriend Betty. I think I was about 6 or 7 at the time. Betty was supposed to visit her one day for a lunch date, but Betty did not attend as promised. The woman showed up at our house angry. She had waited all day for Betty to show up. Betty's response to it was to actually explode in her face, yelling back at her, using me as an excuse for not meeting with her. She told this lady I had the mumps or something and that she had to stay home and look after me. The woman's face immediately dropped and she ran to me, touching my face and neck, apologising profusely to Betty. But it was a lie, and I knew it. I was not sick, but I was also too scared and too shocked to say otherwise. Clarence had just arrived home from work to witness it all and intervene, calming Betty down. Betty was screaming for the lady to get out of our house. After the lady left, Clarence tried to talk to Betty to understand why she had refused to visit the lady as agreed. I do not remember hearing her excuse. I was probably sent to my room, which was a frequent occurrence. At the time, I was so young. I had no idea of Betty's lies and manipulations and how far she would go to get her own way. Many years later, in a discussion with Clarence, I would come to understand that Betty's often strange behaviours were evident to him not long after they were married. He said that they would have arranged to go with friends after he came home from work. She would be ready and waiting, sitting on the lounge ready to go. But immediately, as they were about to leave, she would refuse to leave the house with no explanation. Unlike Clarence, who thrived on mateship and could be the centre of the party, Betty was more reserved, quiet, and even hesitant around others. Though there have been times that she has suddenly burst out with some very embarrassing behaviours without a care of where she was and what she said or did, much to our embarrassment. Her inability to mix with others meant that she failed to show up to many school events, even the ones I participated in, such as sports events, inter-school carnivals, and end-of-year Christmas celebrations. What I remember most was all the other mothers who did show up with their lovely picnic baskets and smiles, eager to watch their children and interact with the other parents. They would set up on the side of the oval for sports day all day and watch their children compete. They would be cheering their child or children on and comfort and console those that lost. These kids would win a ribbon and run off to their parent all excited to show them. This is where they'd be encouraged and given hugs and pats on the backs. I would win a ribbon and just shove it in my pocket and show my mother when I got home. She would smile and congratulate me, but it just wasn't the same. I loved sports and was a long-distance runner, could actually high jump pretty well for a little kid. I know there were times she said she'd try and come, but she never did. I always felt sad and alone when my mother never showed up for these events. I had no one to share my wins with, no one to cheer me on, no special picnic lunch to enjoy with my mother, siblings or friends. I had to sit alone, eating my sandwich and drink my warm cordial that had been left under a tree in a school bag in the hot sun. I didn't want to intrude on my friends and their families. It felt odd to do so. I just found a quiet spot to sit and maybe find another kid whose parent did not show up either. It's funny how I still feel that way today. Even though I get invited to a close friend's family gatherings, I still feel strange, like I'm intruding. When I was married, I didn't notice it so much, but I do now. Maybe because as a divorced woman, I feel alone again, similar to the way I did as a kid. I still don't belong. I'm not part of their family. I'm an intruder, and it does not feel right at all to be there. I played softball as a kid and was really good at it. My best position was pitcher or shortstop. We had an official school team and competed against other schools. Some of the mothers of my teammates would show up for these events, but my mother never did. She never watched me play. She showed no interest in ever nurturing my strong interest in sports. I know my younger brother also expressed the same. He had the ability to be an incredible sportsman, but he was never encouraged, never nurtured, and never supported to pursue his sporting dreams either. Brian entered a boxing contest at school when he was really young, and Betty pulled him out and refused for him to participate. I know it really upset Brian. It did not mean that Betty did not get involved in the things we liked. She did. One time I wanted a ventriloquist doll, and to my surprise, she ended up buying it for me, and I was over the moon. I taught myself how to speak without moving my lips, and would put on little shows for her. She loved it, and I loved that I made her laugh. I got so good at it, I was asked by the principal of my school to put on a show at Christmas time in front of everyone. That is the only time I ever remember my mother attending any of the school events. The most incredible thing she ever did for me was to buy me a horse. This was not long after we moved to Park Ridge to live on 20 acres of property. I had begged for a horse as a very little girl, and on my 13th birthday, I finally got my wish. I had never received any sort of gift like it ever in my life, and I was truly grateful and ecstatic. Cougar was a 9-month-old registered part-bred chestnut Arab with 4 white socks and a perfect white blaze. Apparently, he cost $300, which was a lot of money back in 1974, and when Clarence found out, he was furious. I know, because I heard them arguing over where the money came from. I didn't just get a horse. I got the $259 Western saddle, the boots, and the cowboy hat I always dreamed of, a big cost for a little kid. That was the first time I found out that Betty would often forge Clarence's signature on his checkbook account. Though they argued loud, it would not be the last time that Betty would do this. It always resulted in heated arguments. I heard her say that the money came from the government check she got for fostering Marla, but Clarence was not totally convinced. Her forging, unfortunately, later inspired me to do the same thing in my teenage years when I was in high school. That's another story for later. For the most part, Betty was a stay-at-home mum. She did not get her license until she was in her 40s. This was only because we were now living in a rural area where there was no public transport. I had known that Betty drove often without a license, especially when we moved to Park Ridge. However, one day the police pulled her over after driving Martha to school one morning. She was very embarrassed and given a fine, which resulted in her finally getting her license. And when we lived at Inala and I attended primary school, I would come home most days and find her in the lounge ironing and watching her favourite TV soap, Days of Our Lives. The house was always clean and tidy. We didn't have much in the way of furniture. It was really basic and sparse. What I strongly remember about our childhood is the food situation in our home. It was also very basic and always sparse as well. Most days when I came home from school, all I could find in the fridge to appease my grumbling stomach was cheese and milk. Some days it wasn't even that. It was just dry bread. Betty once worked outside the home for a short time. I believe I was about 10 years old, as I was in grade 4. She took a job working at the Brisbane's Boys' College in the laundry. I remember having to help my little brother off to school in the mornings because she left so early. Sometimes she was not home when I got home either. Being the child in the family, I was the one made responsible for keeping the house clean. If it wasn't clean when either of our parents got home, I was in deep trouble. The Queensland exhibition, known as the Ekka, was always an exciting time for us kids, as Betty always made a great fuss about taking us. But it was a good fuss. We would get rather spoilt with show bags and spend the whole day there. We would have to walk to the bus stop very early, which then drove us to the train station to catch a ride to the city. There was a lot of walking involved, and Betty had 3 of us kids in tow. We always did what Betty said, and we always had a wonderful time. At the end of the day, we'd walk back to the train station, bundled with show bags, tired and worn out little legs and arms, and make the long trek home, exhausted but happy. On the walk home, she would tell us to go straight to our rooms with our show bags and not to tell our father. That was a common theme with a lot of things she bought us. I imagined it was because she had found a very creative way getting around the problem of money without Clarence catching on. Though I'm truly grateful for Betty's efforts to give us the gifts and nice experiences she did, I've come to realise that it all had a price. At the time, I had no idea what these gifts or good deeds would cost me. But as I grew and my eyes were opened, I began to challenge things or happened to not meet her expectations. All that gift giving and doing for you would slap you right in the face. Betty seemed to never want you to do things for her, but then out of the blue she would scream at you, "What have you ever done for me?" And you could not answer her because she blocked a lot of your ability to help her in the first place. Writing about Betty is complicated for me. Like Clarence, I do hold some good memories of her. However, I certainly have some really bad ones as well. And then there are the memories I totally forgot. These things I'll speak of later. In reality, as a small child, I had no idea of the damage caused by her behaviours and just how adversely affected I was by the trauma and carnage she inflicted. I once told a counsellor that living with my adoptive mother was like navigating a war-torn jungle with booby traps and snipers. In a war, you was always grateful for the days you were not shot or maimed. You may have lived in constant fear, anxiety, and anticipation that at any moment, without warning, pain and misery could claim you. Like a bullet from a hidden sniper or a well-concealed landmine, one wrong move, one wrong decision landed a soldier in hospital, sent home, wounded or dead. However, in my war, there was no hospital, no safe place to retreat to, called home, and if death came calling, you were on your own. Betty got away with a lot because none of us could really explain what happened or why. Things would seem fine one minute and then they just weren't, and you were suddenly left bewildered, confused and afraid with no answers at all. Betty would at times just implode, then disappear for periods and reappear as if nothing had happened. As you attempted to figure it out, you'd be stonewalled and given the cold shoulder. There were times when you'd be accused of things you never did or ever think to do. I remember her telling me she had spies that watched me and reported on me even when I was at school, and as a small child, I believed her. Betty was not the best cook, and as we got older, my brothers and I would comment about how often she burnt the food. Plus, if you dared to come home late, she would deliberately leave your food in the oven to burn even more. You'd sit there and look down at it, not game to eat it, because you knew all hell would break loose if you didn't. The scariest part was that even Clarence did not dare to refuse to eat it either. Sometimes he would try and make some sort of joke at it. But if Clarence knew he was in the doghouse as well for coming home late, he knew it was going to be a lot worse if he did not eat her cooking. Sometimes if you were lucky, the dogs would be under the table and you could quickly try and slip the dogs your food. But gee, it was awfully depressing when they even refused to eat it. Sometimes I would hide the food in a pocket and ditch it later. I did the same thing with sandwiches she gave me for lunch at school, and I got caught hiding them in my room. Man, I never did that again. She hit the roof. I don't know how she would manage to make a basic sandwich taste awful or unappetizing, but she did. I think Betty and I got on the most based on my love of animals. We had that in common. However, I will share a story with you later that will cause you to wonder even about that aspect of her. It was something terrible I witnessed as a teenager, but somehow placed far back in my mind to later retrieve as an adult. It utterly broke me. I always had a love for books. Though I never saw Betty ever reading a book, she did support my interest. The school would hand out a magazine that advertised books, comics, and magazines, and Betty always seemed to find a few dollars for me to get the books I liked. Books were my wonderful escape. I travelled the world, solved mysteries, and did amazing things in every page. I was never interested in love stories, but stories of adventures, especially if they had animals involved. There was a magazine-type comic book that I was hooked on that came as a series. It was set in England. It was about 3 siblings whose mother disappears. They run away from the authorities because they were going to be split up by social workers, and then they find refuge and safety in a cave. The girl was about 14 with a younger brother and a baby sister. They hid away, finding creative ways to survive and stay together. At the end of the story, they get found out, but then they come to know that their mother had suffered a medical episode and suffered amnesia, but was recovering. All through the book, the children had fought the idea that their mother had deliberately abandoned them. How ironic that as a small girl, I gravitated to this story. And out of all the books and literature I read, this is the only one I still clearly remember. Clarence had passed away in 2008. It was now 2016. Betty had sold their home on Macleay Island soon after he passed away. They had retired there in 1995. Of course, Clarence chose to live on an island near the sea, where he was in walking distance to his boat that he would leave constantly in the water. Finally, in retirement, he could go fishing and crabbing whenever he wanted. But now that home was gone, and Betty now lived alone in a very small, unassuming, tired little brick home in the suburbs. I don't think Betty was overly happy about island life. In a small community, it is harder to hide and harder to be unsociable. I was not surprised she sold up the minute Clarence died and moved away from the island. She moved closer to Marla and to Marla's children. I sat in the car now, gathering myself together, wondering what I would find. Were there more secrets to unravel behind this door? Would I finally have the answer to Betty's strange behaviours? Would her stay in a hospital amount to anything? Was she mentally unwell? And what deep, dark secrets did she hold on to that she's never let go of or received healing for? I did not know what to expect when I turned the key. With a mask on my face with a few drops of peppermint oil wiped across it to conceal any terrible smells I might encounter, as my sister had told me that the house had smelt terrible when she visited last. But was my sister telling me the truth, or had I been unwittingly duped into their dysfunctional relationship and played the fool? It would not be the first time it had happened. Regardless, I knew Betty needed some sort of help, and as per usual, it was Kerry who stepped up. But which Kerry was going to reveal themselves when I walked in that door? The child Kerry or the adult Kerry? The broken Kerry or the healed Kerry? I just didn't know, and in doing so, would I undo all the good work I'd gained being away for 8 years? Did I really win round 3 with Betty by getting her to comply and hand me her house keys and allowing me to enter her home? Was I being set up to lose any gains I thought I may have achieved? I knew Betty. Nothing was ever easy with her, and I had an old sinking feeling that my wins may not last. There was a lot I need to unravel about Betty, and I've jumped a little forward and backwards in this chapter. I hope it has helped you to know a bit more about her. I've tried to be fair and honest in my depictions of her so far, though some may say Betty just got off lightly, and I would not blame them. I hope you stick around, because I'm about to turn that key and find out what is on the other side.